Good morning, everybody. This is Wesley Hudson, Chair of Prosperity and Livability Committee, and I'd like to call our meeting to order this morning. Present with us in City Hall today is Councilmember Michael Holmes, Councilmember Monica Peters, and I'm Wesley Hudson. Absent is Cyril Jefferson this morning. We have two items on the agenda this morning. The first is an update on the broadband strategy from Guilford County, and I believe we have Emily Toland on.
Yes, good morning. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
My colleague, Sean Fernando and Sophia Pan are also joining us, and we'll be providing a brief overview of the Guilford County Broadband Strategy. I'll go ahead and share my screen if that's all right.
Yes, please.
Sure.
Yes.
Great. All right. I'll first hand it off to Sean to do a little bit of project orientation, and then we'll dive into the updates.
Great, thank you, Emily. Good morning, council members. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for taking the time to allow us to share our project. By way of introduction, my name is Sean Fernando. I'm a director at Guidehouse. We're a consulting firm that has been brought on by Guilford County to assist in the development of its county-wide broadband strategy. As Emily mentioned, I'm joined by herself as project manager. My engagement partner, Mike Tosh, sends his regrets. He's not able to join, but we are supported today by Sophia Pan. So that's who's involved in the from the Guidehouse team. We've been working for the last few months with Guilford County, including the County Manager's Office, Michael Halford, Assistant County Manager, and the new Guilford County CIO. So next slide, please. So in terms of what we'd like to cover today, I mentioned that we've been kind of on the ground for a couple of months now. We'd like to really share, the purpose of the county-wide broadband strategy. We've had kind of representation from High Point as well as part of that. What the strategy development process looks like, the broadband and digital equity gaps and needs identification, how we've gone about that. Fourthly, we'd like to talk about the funding preview, because this has really been the kind of galvanizing force from the release of federal funding to address digital inequity and digital gaps in broadband. And then finally, how you can support. So that sounds good. I'm going to the next slide. So let's just start by kind of addressing what is the Guilford County Broadband Strategy. I think one of the things that you will note is that COVID really made apparent our kind of dependency on the internet to do things that we would have otherwise done in person, for everything from remote learning to doctor's appointments to e-commerce and kind of all the rest of it. And so there's been a push around the country to help, in the light of COVID, help address broadband and connectivity gaps and opportunities across the US. And our objective here is to identify the gaps and opportunities in Guilford County and develop a plan in which we can identify and allocate federal funding to plug those gaps. And beyond that kind of title, what this is really about is it's a question of equity, because the internet is kind of one of those pieces of what's considered public infrastructure, which is entirely privately owned. And so when you have entirely kind of privately owned systems, that leads to kind of practices and kind of market structures that don't necessarily lend itself to ensuring that everybody has equitable access to the internet. And so we'll be looking at some of the issues around the legislative and policy environment, the physical infrastructure, the market structures, to help understand where those gaps are in Guilford County and what kind of tools we might kind of point towards those gaps and to overcome those challenges. Some of the questions that we're hoping, sorry, if you could just go back one slide. Some of the questions that we're hoping to address are, what are those gaps and opportunities, and how does it relate to some of the things that people depend on the internet for, such as education and online learning, healthcare, business and connectivity? How can Guilford County counteract some of this historical inequities? Because if you look at, the extent of broadband, and we can go into a little bit of this at the right point in the presentation, the folks who don't have the internet are often the folks who are underserved in other ways as well and come from kind of, lower income backgrounds. So how can we counteract those historical inequities? And one of the things that we heard from Guilford County is that given that this is, privately owned and privately kind of structured piece of infrastructure, how do we validate the self-reported data from internet service providers? How do we make sure that we have accurate data so that we can make tailored and fine-tuned plans? And I think there are two big questions here. Firstly, how do we optimally allocate the money that's been made available from the federal government and the state to plug those gaps as it relates to broadband? And then finally, recognizing that this is not something that unfortunately local government can kind of wave a magic wand and solve by itself. How can the county partner with internet service providers, utilities, and cities such as yourselves to increase access to broadband penetration? So next slide, please. So we're taking a 3-step process to developing the strategy. So there's a lot kind of going on this page, but if you just kind of follow the chevrons across the top, the first phase is really about understanding facts on the ground, gathering data, and a large part of this is also preparing for stakeholder engagement, so understanding the universal stakeholder entities and viewpoints and who those organizations are. Secondly, the second step, which we began in November, is conducting gaps and opportunities assessment. Part of this is, as you might imagine, desktop-based, looking at GIS maps of infrastructure and layering on top of that socioeconomic maps. Another part of that is also looking at peers and where others are succeeding. And then also when it comes to stakeholder engagement, hearing the lived experiences through focus groups and community meetings so that we really understand and have that color of what the digital divide in Guilford County looks like. And then finally, the third phase, which we're currently now actually compiling and synthesizing all of that together to develop and draft this countywide broadband strategy. And as part of that, we want to look at how do we kind of address those gaps, as I mentioned, how to use ARPA and infrastructure bill and other sorts of funding to address those gaps to get some of these solutions off the ground. And then essentially provide a roadmap for how the county can work with with stakeholders and other entities to collaboratively and creatively think of digital solutions which bridge that digital divide. So the picture on the bottom just shows the picture on the bottom just shows the kind of timeline, and you'll see that we're kind of at the point now where we're kind of synthesizing and compiling this broadband strategy together. So us meeting with you and presenting to you today is timely because we would very much love to get your feedback as part of this synthesis. Next slide, please. So I think one of the things that's important to note is that the discourse around broadband tends to kind of frame it as, a supply side or infrastructure side, objective, right? Like the analogs are, it's like highways and it's like power, it's like water and other types of utilities. And that's true to an extent. But, it's not simply a matter of like building it and suddenly people kind of get connected. There are a whole range of other reasons why people might not necessarily be able to fully access or or take advantage of internet connectivity, and those could be to do with factors that are to do with their socioeconomic circumstances. And so we need to kind of think expansively about, what are the areas in which contribute to the lack of availability, the lack of affordability and adoption. And they may include infrastructure, but it may also include things such as creditworthiness or digital literacy, or, if you're potentially, like my parents, you kind of wait for your grandchildren to come around so that they can reset the internet router, that kind of thing. And so it's that kind of framing that we're taking to this, because this allows us to think creatively about where those gaps in Guilford County are, and also creatively around some of the solutions to accomplish that. And so what you see on this picture on the top left is we're looking at the legislative and policy context. So looking at the kind of rules and the regulations and the permissibility of what's, of how broadband penetration across Guilford County is structured. The second element on the top right is looking at the market structure. And what this really means is, who are the players in the internet service providers, the household names such as Spectrum and Verizon and AT&T, but it was also some of the smaller, more disruptive and commercial players. And that market structure is important to know, to understand, what are the packages being offered? What are the price plans? How much of the county is covered by one or two providers, and how do we kind of drive consumer choice? The third piece on the bottom left is the infrastructure aspect of all of this, which is I would say is the more tangible aspect of when we come to the conversation of broadband. So this is fixed and wireless assets and fiber and Wi-Fi hotspots and that kind of thing. And then the fourth element on the bottom right are socioeconomic factors and needs, which are really a lens to all of these, really, which looks at household income and educational attainment and that kind of thing, which aims to understand some of those kind of non-infrastructural barriers to broadband availability, affordability, and adoption. So this is our kind of research hypothesis, and you can progress to the next slide. And what we're aiming to culminate in is the Guilford County Broadband Strategy. So this is a county-wide and ecosystem-wide strategy. So this exists as a document, but we're trying to also not just create a document, we're also trying to inspire movement. And so there are a number of components which go into this to help the county to work with its partners to get up and running, to execute some of these recommendations. So the first part of that is on the top left, the strategic recommendations of, based on the data, based on the analysis of where the gaps are and where the opportunities are, what are the right moves that the county can play? Given that, it is one stakeholder among many in, addressing the kind of internet gaps and opportunities. The second piece is that analysis of the funding opportunities. So once we've identified an opportunity, how do we kind of match that to the right fund? What is the right funding structure, down to the specific fund or grant program from the federal government based on its eligibility criteria. Excuse me. So that really helps us kind of turbocharge some of the recommendations that we're making with specific actions on how these projects might get off the ground. The third element of this on the top right is the kind of broadband typology, which is basically a little bit of a deeper dive into the analysis and the rationale and the justification of where the kind of opportunities are within the county. The fourth on the bottom left are portfolio-specific recommendations. So things such as creating new structures, processes, certain types of solutions for certain neighborhoods. And this is based on that kind of geospatial analysis to look at, what is the right solution for this particular neighborhood, given its, access to internet service providers, given the socioeconomics and demographics of its area, as well as some of the other kind of factors that have gone into that analysis as well.
Sorry.
Oh, there might have been some connection. Oh, you're back, Sean.
Okay, can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay, my apologies. So just calling your attention to the implementation roadmap, which is a piece of a component of the strategy, which basically sequence all of these recommendations into something that is pragmatic, that the county with its stakeholders can work in a stepwise fashion to implement, because recognizing that it cannot accomplish all of these recommendations at the same time, and nor would it want to. And the final piece of the strategy is this broadband task force. And this is really where it goes from strategy through to execution, which is mobilizing this coalition of the willing, of stakeholders and partners who've been working with the county through this process to actually convert this plan into action. And so the role of this broadband task force will be to collaborate in a sustained way with the county to ensure that these recommendations are being executed, that they are supported, that they are kind of providing channels to engage with the community and create that cycle of input. And what our objective here again is to create not just a high-level strategy and a glossy document that sits on itself, but a sense of kind of coherence, direction for the county, practical funding options, as well as a mobilized and empowered stakeholder group who can take the recommendations from this work and begin execution. So that was a lot. I'm going to pause there, and I will pass it over to Emily to talk through the next section of our presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Sean. So now that you have a little bit of an understanding of the overview and the background of the project itself, wanted to brief you all on some of the things that we've been learning and hearing from the community. So this slide that you see in front of you depicts the data visualization component of the work that we've been doing. And we've been using geospatial mapping as a way to help us visualize and sort of tell the story behind the inequities that we see kind of visually when we talk about disparities on a map. And so on the map on the right, you can see some high-level mapping findings that we've put together. This is organized by commissioner districts, just because we've been doing our reporting largely to the Board of Commissioners. But when we do our data analysis and kind of inner reports, we do have maps that have the municipal boundaries as well, kind of to help with that stakeholder engagement and communication about where the different gaps are. So in looking a little bit closer at the map, you can see that the districts outlined in blue, we found have areas that have the greatest consumer choice and highest quality of broadband in terms of the number of provider options that are there and then internet speeds available. In districts 1, 2, 7, and 8, you can see those in red. And that definitely has overlap with where the city of High Point is. And we see that those districts have less consumer choice and may also face some affordability barriers. And District 4, which I believe touches sort of the eastern edge of High Point, we find is largely rural and has less consumer choice and overall the lowest quality broadband, just because oftentimes there just isn't the level of service provider provision that's there, or the access technologies are largely satellite or something that only accommodates slower speeds. And so I kind of have that call out box there just to note that the areas that we see in our analysis currently with the city of High Point largely are falling into the low affordability and low adoption category for us, according to the broadband index we've developed, which takes a number of quantitative analysis approaches to different data sets that are available from the FCC, American Community Survey, et cetera, that we've been synthesizing and using to help us identify what those gaps are. So another component of the work that we've been doing has also relied extensively on public engagement. And so this is meant to really qualify and help validate the things that we're seeing in the quantitative analysis. And so we've had several methods of public engagement, 2 different surveys, one of which we've partnered with the state for the North Carolina Broadband Survey and Speed Test. The second survey has been one that's mostly focused on internet access, so a little bit more on the affordability. And that was something that we've launched with our partners P3 here in the county. We also hosted 6 virtual lived experience focus groups, along with 5 gaps and opportunities committee meetings across the county. And then to complement that and help inform the prioritization that's going into the strategy, we held 8 virtual strategic approach focus groups as well. And so the things that we were hearing added a lot of color, I would say, to what we were seeing the analysis. And so some of the things we heard from the community were related to how indispensable that internet is for daily activities, things like education and work. People also spoke to us about the increase in price for a broadband cable package doubling in the past decade. We heard also the importance of internet and Wi-Fi hotspots and things for people who need assistance. So when they're signing up for rental assistance programs because of COVID, or trying to look up hours for food pantry because with the kind of low levels of kind of workers and the high turnover, sometimes food pantries haven't been able to offer the same amount of hours as normal, but needing to use the internet to be able to check on those things, to be able to get the assistance that they need. We also heard quite a bit from Guilford County schools and nonprofits who work with students about the inability of students to be able to access the internet, either because they lack transportation or because the Wi-Fi hotspot strength wasn't strong enough based off of where they live, and that being really detrimental to their learning outcomes. And we also heard from people in more of the rural parts of the county where they felt like they were being held hostage to the ISP providers in their area, where they really only had one choice when it came to internet. And that choice was insufficient for the things that they were looking to do on a daily basis, where they were having calls drop during work hours, where their children were actually able to access the remote learning system that had been developed. And so rich feedback from community members like these really added color, as I mentioned, to the gaps and needs analysis that we've been using to identify where the gaps are in Guilford County. And stakeholder public engagement are kind of like one piece of the three main areas that we've been looking at when we're looking to craft our strategy. So you can see up in the gears kind of on the left, we've got stakeholder and public engagement, which as I went over that previous slide. And the goal here has really been to incorporate diverse perspectives and making sure that we have community priorities represented in the strategy. And this has been complemented by the mapping, which kind of you saw 2 slides ago, which is visually highlighting those inequities. And then also this broadband index that I've briefly mentioned that we've developed, which is a model for which we are basing the gaps and opportunities off of. And so we've been really layering different geographic spatial analyses components together to indicate the areas where there's broadband availability, affordability, and adoption gaps. And so all of these things are working together to inform the strategy, and that's what the team is really focused on now. And so you can see some examples of different tailored recommendations on the right. So things like ISP broadband infrastructure investment, maybe grant programs or loan programs for people who are struggling in the moment, free Wi-Fi access in public spaces, digital navigators programs. And so what we're doing is we're taking the information that we've received on the left and using that to help craft what the specific strategies are that we're making recommendations for Guilford County to make sure that, you know, what we're recommending is not a one-size-fits-all. We know that it's going to differ depending on where in the county you're located, and Guilford County's needs are different than other counties' needs as well. And so that's how this is all kind of tying together and fitting together. Another important component of the work that we're doing is looking into the strategy funding opportunities. So when we think about you know, all these different projects, all of them are going to cost a certain level of investment. And so what funding sources can we recommend that the county and its partners tap into to help fund these projects? And so some of the things that we're looking at are the American Rescue Plan funds, which we know are kind of, there's a lot of things that are eligible for that. And so some of the projects that will be worked on are likely not broadband specific, but there are many other grants and opportunities available that are broadband specific when it comes to both federal and state funding sources. And so we're looking closely into these and trying to see where we can match them with the specific targeted recommendations that we are making in order to provide the county with a roadmap, not only for what projects to implement, but also where to find funding sources to help offset the cost there. And so one of the things that we wanted to conclude on was just how you as part of the city of High Point can help and kind of what the county is looking for your assistance in when they think about this strategy and beyond. And so the first thing is really collaborating with the county to implement the recommendations once we develop the strategy, which will be drafted in a couple of weeks. And so once this engagement concludes and our time with the county has ended, they will need partners to help implement those targeted strategies that we're recommending. And so I think that the City of Greensboro, City of High Point, the libraries, all the people who've been involved so far and extending that network outward will be really key players in working with the county to move the ball forward. Another kind of thing to go along with that is being an active supporter of the Broadband Task Force. When we think about the different specific recommendations and targeted strategies, there will be strategies where the county plays the main driver role, but there will also be strategies where it will rely on the libraries or a nonprofit or another partner to move the ball forward. And so where needed, we hope that the City of High Point can be an active supporter in the implementation of those strategies and the Broadband Task Force. And the last item is to publicize and participate in the North Carolina Broadband Survey. This is being put out by the North Carolina Department of Broadband Infrastructure, and it's a way for them to gather additional data on the ground to complement what has been publicly released by the FCC. The FCC data is a little bit of an overestimate in terms of the availability of internet, and so this is intended to provide additional supplemental information to help the overall state make decisions about where broadband investment is needed in the county. And so the more people who are able to fill that out, provide information, will give the state a better idea of where that investment needs to occur. I've listed kind of the contact information of some members of our team as well as the county staff. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're also happy to take questions now if time allows. But thank you so much for allowing us to brief you on where we are in the project and ways that the county can partner with you moving forward once this engagement concludes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emily. Questions from council? No? Well, can you clarify when you say low affordability, that means the percentage of affordability, so it's not affordable?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So when I'm saying low availability, low affordability, low adoption, those are the areas in which those are barriers. So cost is a barrier, or there's no infrastructure, so infrastructure is a barrier, or there's no devices, for example. And so adoption is a barrier.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us, and feel free to reach out. Eric has been wonderful working with us on the steering committee, so he also is able to answer questions too if you need to ask him something or ask for an update on this.
Very good. Thank you. Look forward to following updates.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Our second agenda item today is a discussion of our special events policy, which I believe Eric Almeida has for us.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Today we brought to you, does everybody have a copy of the list that we presented? If not, I've got it.
It's the same as last. It has not been changed, has it? Is that the same?
Thank you.
It's the same as last year, minus the Christmas tree.
So what we presented to you today is a slightly updated list from what was approved at the last meeting about a year and a half ago, I believe. With COVID, as you know, a lot of these events have not occurred in the last couple of years. So we have taken the opportunity to review the list, to take off a couple of events that were really city internal events that really didn't belong on this list of what should be just external events. And we've added, down at the bottom, we added the Truist Point Christmas tree lighting event that occurred this year. This was not intended to be a comprehensive list. We know there are some events that may be out there that we're not aware of or that are being proposed or worked on right now. We also know that there may be some events on this list that won't occur this year or maybe taking a year off or maybe not coming back at all. The other concept that we wanted to bring to you is that we know that the CVB and Forward High Point will potentially have some events that they're working on that aren't fully realized yet. We haven't been updated yet completely on what that may be. So we would like to ask that the committee and the council set aside some funding. We have identified some existing funding so that we may bring those back to you when those are fully realized and bring those back for approval.
Okay. Any questions on the list? I think it's basically the same with that. Added the soccer tournament and the tree lighting, but basically the same list.
And as I said, as we learn of other events, we will bring those forward. But the other thing that we wanted to, just caution is that so many of these events really rely on our public safety folks, police and fire. And as we discussed with council, we're at a historic vacancy rates there, and so this, additional events really stress our ability to properly staff these events.
So Eric, this the $30,000 is just a rough estimate based on this list and not anything that may come. So if there's something added, we may have to go back and do some type of adjustment to this number.
Well, the 30,000 really doesn't affect this list. This list, there isn't really a budget impact. These items on this list are more in-kind services that we already, we have staff and equipment that would support these. If the 30,000 is, if the CVB brings forward an event and they are asking for funding, then they would run the event and we would potentially come to the point where we exceed that 30,000, we bring it back to the council.
Okay.
Any other questions? So we need a motion to take this to full council, correct?
Yes.
Motion to approve, so I entertain a motion to approve.
Second?
There's a motion and a second on the floor. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you all. If there is nothing further to come before the committee, we will adjourn. Summarily, we are adjourned.